The late afternoon sun of August 15, 1895, blazed mercilessly over the desolate prairie as Callum Burke trudged along the dusty wagon trail toward the Rowe homestead. His weathered leather boots kicked up small clouds of dirt with each step, and sweat stained his flannel shirt, despite the approaching evening hour. At 32 years old, Callum carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to hard labor, though his dark eyes held shadows that spoke of recent grief. The Rowe farm appeared on the horizon like a mirage, a modest wooden house flanked by a weathered barn and scattered outbuildings, all dwarfed by the endless expanse of brown grassland stretching in every direction. What struck Callum immediately was the isolation. No neighboring farms were visible, no roads led anywhere but back to the distant town of Cedar Falls, 5 miles behind him. As he approached the main house, Callum noticed details that made his woodsman's instincts prickle with unease. The property was too quiet, no sounds of livestock except for a few chickens scratching in the yard, no signs of recent visitors or normal farm activity. Most peculiar was a small wooden structure in the far corner of the yard that appeared to be an outhouse. But it was reinforced with heavy iron chains, wrapped multiple times around its frame, and secured with a thick padlock that gleamed unnaturally new against the weathered wood. Before Callum could knock on the front door, it swung open to reveal a stern-faced man of about 50, with graying hair and suspicious pale blue eyes. Clayton Rowe stood just over average height, but possessed the wiry strength of someone who had worked the land for decades. His clothes were clean but patched, suggesting a farmer who labored hard but struggled financially. "What do you want, stranger?" Clayton's voice carried the sharp edge of a man who trusted no one. "Name's Callum Burke, sir. I'm looking for honest work chopping wood, mending fences, whatever needs doing. The folks in Cedar Falls mentioned you might be hiring temporary help for harvest season." Callum kept his tone respectful but direct, the approach learned from years of dealing with wary employers. Clayton studied him with the intensity of a hawk examining prey. "Where you from, Burke?" "Been working the lumber camps up north near Duluth. Contract ended 2 weeks ago, and I've been walking south looking for work ever since." The explanation was truthful, but incomplete. Callum had left the camps voluntarily after his younger brother Sean died in a sawmill accident crushed by a falling tree while Callum was away fetching supplies. The guilt of that failure had driven him to wander from job to job, rather than face the memories that haunted familiar places. "You got references, papers?" Callum reached into his shirt pocket and produced a folded letter of recommendation from his last foreman, along with a worn daguerreotype showing him and Sean standing beside a massive pine they had felled together. The photo was 2 years old, taken just months before the accident that changed everything. Clayton examined both items carefully, his eyes lingering on the photo. "This your brother?" "Was. He died in an accident." Callum's voice remained steady, but his jaw tightened slightly. Behind Clayton, a thin woman with prematurely gray hair and anxious features appeared in the doorway. This had to be Ada Rowe, though she looked older than her probable 40-odd years, with deep worry lines etched around her brown eyes and a nervous habit of wringing her hands. "Ada," Clayton called over his shoulder without taking his eyes off Callum. "Set another plate for supper." But he fixed Callum with a hard stare. "You do exactly what I tell you and nothing else. This is private land, and we keep to ourselves out here. I don't tolerate snooping questions or wandering around where you don't belong." The intensity of the warning seemed excessive for a simple job arrangement. But Callum had encountered plenty of isolated farm families made paranoid by hard times and distance from civilization. "Fair enough, Mr. Rowe. Just point me toward what needs doing. I need my winter wood split before the weather turns. It's late in the season, which is why I'm willing to hire temporary help." Clayton led him to a substantial pile of logs beside the barn, positioning the work area within clear sight of the house. "You'll work here during daylight hours. I'll provide meals and a place to sleep in the barn. 3 days' work should finish the job, then you move on." As Callum stripped off his shirt and began splitting wood with the powerful practice strokes of an experienced woodsman, he observed the layout of the property more carefully. The farmhouse appeared well-maintained despite its modest size, and the fields showed evidence of recent harvest activity. Yet something felt fundamentally wrong about the place, an atmosphere of tension that had nothing to do with normal rural caution. During his second hour of work, as sweat glistened on his muscled back and shoulders, Callum heard something that made him pause mid-swing. A sound carried faintly on the hot breeze, so distant and muffled, he almost dismissed it as imagination. But there it was again, what sounded unmistakably like a human voice crying out in distress. "Keep working." Clayton's sharp command cracked across the yard from the house porch, where the farmer had positioned himself with a clear view of both Callum and the surrounding property. "Storm's building in the west, and I want that wood split before it hits." But Callum could see no storm clouds on the horizon, and the urgency in Clayton's tone seemed disproportionate to the actual weather conditions. He resumed chopping, but kept his ears alert for any repetition of the sound. 20 minutes later, he heard it again, definitely a cry for help, though its source remained maddeningly unclear. When Ada called him for supper, her hands trembled noticeably as she served him beans, cornbread, and salted pork. The meal was simple but filling, and Callum ate gratefully, while Clayton peppered him with questions designed to probe his background and intentions. "You said you worked lumber camps. Those crews usually travel together when contracts end. How come you're alone?" "Some men went back to their families, others took different jobs. I preferred traveling solo, easier to find work that way." The partial truth came easily, but Callum omitted his real reason for avoiding close relationships since Sean's death. "What kind of accident killed your brother?" The question hit like a physical blow, but Callum kept his expression neutral. "Tree fell wrong at the mill. Happened fast." Clayton leaned back in his wooden chair, studying Callum's face for any sign of deception. "Must have been hard losing family like that." "Yes, sir, it was." Throughout the meal, Ada said virtually nothing, though Callum noticed her stealing glances at him with an expression that seemed to mix curiosity with something like desperate hope. When she cleared his plate, her fingers briefly touched his hand, and he felt them shaking. After supper, Clayton escorted him to the barn with unnecessary emphasis on security procedures. "The doors get locked from outside at night. We've had trouble with coyotes and worse. You stay put until morning, understand?" "Understood." But as they crossed the yard, Callum's attention was drawn again to that peculiar chained outhouse. "That's some serious hardware for a privy." Clayton's face darkened. "We've had animals get in, make a mess of things. The chains keep them out." The explanation came too quickly, and behind them Ada's sharp intake of breath suggested it wasn't entirely truthful. Settled into the hay with his bedroll, Callum lay awake as full darkness descended over the prairie. The normal sounds of night surrounded him. Whined through the barn eaves, distant coyote calls the settling of old wood. But sometime after midnight, another sound cut through the natural symphony that made his blood run cold. A wail of pure desperation echoed across the yard, high, anguished, and unmistakably human. It came from the direction of that chained structure, and there could be no mistake about its nature. Someone was trapped in there, crying out for help that never came. The sound repeated twice more over the next hour, each time more heartbreaking than the last. Callum sat up in the hay, his mind racing. Everything about this situation was wrong: the excessive security, Clayton's paranoid behavior, Ada's nervous fear, and now these nighttime cries. Someone was being held prisoner on this farm, and every instinct told him it was connected to that heavily secured outhouse. He thought of Sean trapped under that massive pine calling for help that arrived too late. The memory steeled his resolve. This time he wouldn't fail to act when someone needed rescue. Dawn came with the crowing of roosters and Clayton's boots on the porch, but Callum had slept little. When he emerged from the barn, the farmer was already waiting with another pile of logs and a watchful expression. "You look tired, Burke." Hope you're not the type to slack off when the work gets demanding. I'll earn my keep, Mr. Rowe. Callum took up his axe, but his eyes kept drifting toward the chained structure. In daylight, he could see that it had been modified additional boards, nailed over natural gaps, making the interior nearly airtight. Fresh boot prints in the dusty ground led directly from the house to the structure and back, made by someone Clayton's size sometime during the night. He worked steadily through the morning, but during a break to drink from the well, he made a discovery that chilled him to the bone. Beside the water pump lay a crumpled piece of paper partially hidden under a loose board. When he carefully retrieved and unfolded it, he found a hastily scrawled note in a different handwriting than what he'd seen from Clayton. See, the Burke fellow asking too many questions. Keep close watch. If he gets suspicious, we handle it permanent like. J. The note was unsigned except for the initial J, but its implications were terrifying. Clayton had an accomplice, someone who knew about Callum's arrival, and considered him a potential threat. More disturbing still was the casual reference to handling problems permanent-like, the language of men accustomed to violence. Burke. Clayton's shout made him quickly pocket the note. The farmer was striding across the yard, his face thunderous. What did I tell you about sticking to your work? Just getting water, sir. The sun's getting fierce hot. The sun's always hot out here. If you can't handle prairie work, you can move on right now. Clayton's right hand rested casually on the handle of the large hunting knife he wore at his belt, a gesture that clearly constituted a threat. I can handle it. Callum returned to his woodpile, but his mind was now focused entirely on the mystery of the imprisoned person and the identity of Clayton's mysterious partner, Jay. The day crawled by with agonizing slowness as Clayton found excuses to remain nearby, watching Callum with predatory intensity. Ada appeared occasionally to tend chickens or hang laundry, but she avoided eye contact and jumped at every sudden sound. Whatever secret this family harbored, it had them both living in constant fear. As evening approached, Callum made a show of exhaustion, complaining of sore muscles and requesting extra blankets for the night. Clayton seemed satisfied by this apparent weakness and retired early, but not before issuing another stern warning about staying put and minding your own business. Callum waited until the farmhouse windows went dark before implementing his plan. Moving with the stealth learned from years of hunting in dense forests, he crept across the moonlit yard toward the chained outhouse. The structure loomed larger in darkness, and he could detect a horrible smell even before reaching it. Not just the expected odor of a privy, but something worse. Something that spoke of decay and human suffering. Pressing his ear to the wooden wall, he whispered as quietly as possible, "Hello, is someone in there?" The response was immediate, a gasp of shock, followed by the sound of someone moving weakly inside the cramped space. "Please," came a voice so faint he had to strain to hear it. "Please help me. I'm so scared." It was definitely a young woman, and the raw terror in her tone made Callum's chest tighten with rage and determination. "I'm going to help you," he whispered back. "But you need to stay very quiet." "What's your name?" "Molly Rowe. I'm their daughter." The revelation hit Callum like a physical blow. This was Clayton and Ada's own child chained in this hellish prison. "How long have you been locked in here?" "Since February. 6 months now." "Please, I'm so thirsty and hungry. The smell is so awful and it's so dark all the time." Her voice broke into quiet sobs that tore at his heart. February to August, half a year of imprisonment in conditions that would break most people. No wonder she sounded so weak. "Molly, I'm going to find a way to get you out. But first you need food and water. Can you hold on until tomorrow night? I don't know if I have a choice. But please don't abandon me. They're planning to kill me. I heard them talking. I know too much about something terrible." "What do you know?" But before she could answer, the sound of a door slamming echoed across the yard. Heavy footsteps crossed the farmhouse porch. "Tomorrow." Callum breathed urgently. "I'll bring food and water tomorrow, and we'll plan your escape." He slipped back to the barn, just as Clayton's voice boomed into the night. "Who's out there? I've got a loaded shotgun, and I'm not afraid to use it." Callum buried himself deep in the hay and forced his breathing to steady his mind, already working on how to help the imprisoned girl while staying alive himself. The morning of August 17th dawned gray and oppressive, with heavy clouds building on the western horizon. Callum had managed to save portions of his breakfast, a crust of bread and some bacon wrapped in his handkerchief, along with a small tin cup filled with water from the well. But every time he glanced toward Molly's prison, Clayton seemed to materialize nearby, watching with those cold, calculating eyes. The farmer's paranoia had clearly intensified overnight. He stayed closer to Callum throughout the morning, finding reasons to inspect the woodpile check tools and generally maintain constant surveillance. It wasn't until well after midnight that Callum finally found his opportunity. This time, he brought the precious food and water, approaching the outhouse with the extreme caution of a man who understood his life depended on remaining undetected. The moon was nearly full, casting stark shadows across the yard and making concealment more difficult. "Molly." He pressed the bread and cup through a narrow gap between the boards. "Can you reach this?" The desperate sounds of her consuming the meager supplies were almost more than he could bear. She drank the water so quickly, he worried she might make herself sick, then devoured the bread with the ravenous hunger of prolonged starvation. "Thank you," she gasped when she'd finished. "You can't know what this means to me. Tell me what happened. Why are you imprisoned like this?" Her voice was slightly stronger now, though still weak from months of malnutrition. "It started in February. We had a temporary ranch hand named Tommy Walsh working here, helping with the cattle through winter. He was a good man, kind to me, always polite to Mother." She paused to gather strength. "One evening in late February, I went to the barn to collect eggs from the chickens we keep there during cold weather. I heard voices, Father and Tommy arguing about something. I hid behind some hay bales to listen. What were they arguing about? Tommy had discovered that Father was stealing cattle from neighboring ranches, changing their brands with a hot iron and selling them to buyers in distant towns. It had been going on for over a year. When Tommy threatened to report the thefts to Marshal Crawford in Cedar Falls, Father became enraged. Molly's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. He grabbed a pitchfork and attacked Tommy. I watched through a gap in the hay bales as they fought. Tommy was younger and stronger, but Father caught him off guard. The pitchfork went right through his chest. There was so much blood. Callum felt sick. "Then your father saw you?" "Yes." I must have made some sound, a gasp or sob, because suddenly Father was looking right at me. His face, it was like looking at a stranger, someone capable of anything. He dragged me from my hiding place and said I was now a witness who could never be allowed to speak. The full horror of the situation became clear. "So he locked you in here. He told everyone in town that I'd suffered a mental breakdown, that I'd become violent and dangerous. He said I had to be kept isolated for everyone's safety. People believed him because he's always been respected in the community, and because..." She paused. "Because what?" "Because he's not working alone. There's someone else involved in the cattle, stealing, someone who helps him plan which animals to take and where to sell them. I heard them talking sometimes at night. Father would meet with this person near the barn. I never saw who it was clearly, but I heard them planning together." This confirmed what Callum had learned from the note. Clayton had a partner, someone with the initial J, who was equally invested in keeping their crimes secret. "Where did your father put Tommy's body?" "Under the floorboards, right beneath where I sit. He dug up the dirt floor and buried him there the same night he killed him. I can..." Sometimes when it rains and the ground gets soft, I can smell the decomposition. The revelation struck Callum like a sledgehammer. Clayton hadn't just imprisoned his daughter, he'd trapped her directly above the corpse of the man he'd murdered, creating a psychological torture that was almost beyond comprehension. "We're getting you out of here," he said firmly. "I don't care what it takes." "There's a spare key," Molly whispered urgently. "Mother keeps one hidden in her sewing box in the house, but she's too terrified to use it. Father told her that if I ever escaped, he'd kill us both and claim we died from my supposed madness. Can you hold on for one more night? I need to figure out how to deal with your father's partner." "I'll have to. But Callum, please be careful. Father isn't just cruel and violent. He's intelligent and cunning. If he suspects what you're doing." Her warning proved prophetic. The next morning, Clayton appeared at the barn before dawn, carrying his shotgun and wearing an expression of barely contained rage. "You've been moving around at night, Burke. Ada says she's heard sounds in the yard." Callum kept his expression neutral while his mind raced. "Could be coyotes or other animals. This is wild country. Could be. Or could be a hired hand who doesn't understand the meaning of stay put." Clayton stepped closer, the gun barrel pointed casually in Callum's direction. "I'm starting to think maybe you're not the simple drifter you claim to be." Before Callum could respond, the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the prairie. A single rider was approaching from the direction of town, moving at a steady trot. Clayton's face went pale, then flushed with anger. "Who's that coming?" Callum asked. "Nobody who concerns you. Get back to work and keep your mouth shut." But Clayton's voice carried an edge of panic that suggested the visitor was definitely unwelcome. The rider turned out to be Marshall Crawford from Cedar Falls, a grizzled man in his 50s with a badge pinned to his vest and a Colt revolver on his hip. He dismounted near the house and approached Clayton with the careful neutrality of an experienced lawman. "Morning, Clayton. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" "About what, Marshall?" "Had a report from one of your neighbors about strange sounds coming from this direction. Crying, maybe screaming. Thought I should check on your family's welfare." Clayton's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "Must have been coyotes or wildcats. We haven't had any troubles here. What about your daughter? Heard she's been unwell." "Molly's condition is difficult. She suffers from spells of violent madness. We've had to keep her isolated for everyone's safety, including her own." Marshall Crawford nodded slowly, but his eyes were alert and assessing. "Mind if I see her just to verify she's being properly cared for?" "I'm afraid that's impossible. Any disturbance or interaction with strangers triggers her violent episodes. The doctor from Cedar Falls examined her months ago and confirmed the diagnosis." The marshal's gaze shifted to Callum, who was pretending to focus on his woodcutting while listening intently. "Who's your hired man?" "Temporary worker. Burke's his name. Came looking for harvest work." "Burke." The marshal approached, studying Callum's face carefully. "You wouldn't happen to be Callum Burke from up north, used to work with the timber crews?" Callum's blood turned to ice. How did the marshal know his name? "Yes, sir. That's me. Thought I recognized you. Got a circular about you a few months back. Seems you used to be a deputy sheriff up in Duluth County before you took to lumber work." The revelation hit like a thunderbolt. Clayton's eyes widened with shock and rage, while Callum realized his carefully constructed new identity was crumbling. He had indeed been a deputy sheriff before his brother's death, a fact he'd hidden from everyone he'd met since leaving that life behind. "That was a long time ago," Callum said carefully. "Not so long. Word is you left under some kind of cloud. Something about failing to prevent a crime that got someone killed." The marshal's tone wasn't accusatory, just curious. "My brother died because I wasn't there when he needed help. I couldn't do the job anymore after that." Marshal Crawford nodded with apparent understanding. "Sometimes the weight gets too heavy to carry. But once lawman, always lawman in some ways. I'd bet you still notice things other folks might miss. The implication was clear, the marshal suspected something was wrong at the Rowe farm and was hoping Callum's law enforcement background might provide insight. But before Callum could respond, Clayton stepped forward aggressively. "Now, Marshal, if you're done with your questions, I'd appreciate you leaving. We've got work to do, and frankly, your presence is upsetting my wife." Indeed, Ada had appeared on the porch and was wringing her hands nervously, though whether from fear of the marshal or fear of her husband was unclear. Of course. The marshal mounted his horse, but fixed Clayton with a steady stare. "I'll be in the area over the next few days. If anyone needs help, anyone at all, they should know I'm available." As the lawman rode away, Clayton turned to Callum with murder in his eyes. "The deputy sheriff," he hissed. "You've been lying to me from the start." "Former deputy, I told you I left that life behind. Nobody leaves law work behind, not really. You came here sniffing around looking for something. What did you find?" The confrontation Callum had been dreading was now inevitable. Clayton raised the shotgun, pointing it directly at his chest. "I found a man trying to make an honest living," Callum said steadily. "Nothing more. Liar." Clayton's finger moved to the trigger. "You've been prowling around at night, asking questions, playing the hero. But you picked the wrong farm and the wrong family to interfere with." The shot never came. Instead, a new voice cut through the tension. Clayton put that gun down. Everyone turned to see a man emerging from behind the barn, tall, lean, with weathered features and clothes that marked him as another local farmer. He carried a rifle and moved with the confidence of someone comfortable with violence. "About time you showed up, Jeremiah," Clayton said without lowering his weapon. "We've got a problem." So this was Jeremiah Clayton's partner in cattle rustling, and apparently much more. The man who had written the note about handling Callum permanent-like if he became too suspicious. "I can see that." Jeremiah studied Callum with cold calculation. "Former deputy sheriff, huh? That explains why you've been so interested in things that don't concern you." "I haven't done anything except chop wood." "Don't lie to us, Burke. Jeremiah here has been watching the property at night. He saw you sneaking around that outhouse, heard you whispering to someone inside." Clayton's voice was filled with triumphant malice. "Did you really think we wouldn't notice?" Callum's heart sank. If Jeremiah had been conducting surveillance, then his secret meetings with Molly were compromised. The girl's life was now in immediate danger. "So what's the plan?" Jeremiah asked Clayton. "Can't let him ride out of here knowing what he knows." "Same plan we always use for problems. Permanent solution." But before either man could act, Ada Rowe surprised everyone by stepping off the porch with a heavy cast-iron skillet in her hands. "No more killing," she said in a voice that shook but carried absolute determination. "I won't be part of any more murder." Clayton spun toward his wife, momentarily distracted. "Ada, get back in the house. This doesn't concern you. It concerns me when you're planning to kill another innocent man. Just like you killed Tommy Walsh. Just like you've been slowly killing our daughter." The admission hung in the air like a gunshot. Ada had finally found the courage to speak the truth, and her words carried the weight of months of suppressed guilt and horror. "You stupid woman," Clayton snarled. "You've just signed all our death warrants." Maybe that's what we deserve. The momentary distraction was all Callum needed. Years of law enforcement training temporarily suppressed by grief and self-doubt suddenly reasserted themselves. He dove sideways as Clayton's shotgun boomed the buckshot, passing harmlessly through the space where he'd been standing. Rolling behind the woodpile, Callum grabbed his axe and prepared for the fight of his life. But this wouldn't be a simple confrontation between two men. He was facing two armed opponents who had already committed murder and wouldn't hesitate to kill again. Jeremiah's rifle cracked, splintering wood inches from Callum's head. The former deputy was trapped behind minimal cover, facing two men with superior weapons and defensive positions. His only advantages were his knowledge of their crimes and his desperation to save Molly. "Give it up, Burke," Clayton shouted as he reloaded his shotgun. "You're outnumbered and outgunned." But Callum had noticed something during his brief glimpse of the yard. Storm clouds were building rapidly overhead, and the wind was picking up significantly. A prairie thunderstorm was approaching, which might provide the chaos and concealment he needed to turn the tables. As if summoned by his thoughts, the first fat raindrops began to fall, followed quickly by a rumble of thunder that rolled across the landscape like the voice of an angry god. "Storm's coming," Jeremiah observed unnecessarily. "Good," Clayton replied. "Thunder will cover the gunshots. No one will hear anything from town. But storms could be unpredictable allies." As the rain intensified and lightning began to flicker in the darkening sky, Callum made his move. Using the noise of thunder to mask his movement, he sprinted from behind the woodpile toward the barn, zigzagging to avoid the rifle shots that followed his path. A bullet tugged at his shirt sleeve, another kicked up dust at his feet, but he made it to the barn wall intact. From there, he had access to the various tools and equipment that might serve as weapons or aids to escape. "He's in the barn," Jeremiah called out. "So we flush him out," Clayton replied grimly, but the storm was growing stronger by the minute. Rain was now falling in heavy sheets, turning the dusty yard into a sea of mud and severely limiting visibility. Lightning strikes were becoming more frequent, accompanied by booming thunder that made communication difficult. Inside the barn, Callum quickly assessed his options. Various farming tools hung from the walls: scythes, pitchforks, hammers, coils of rope. More importantly, he found a box of rifle cartridges and an old Henry repeating rifle that looked functional despite its age. As he loaded the weapon, his lawman's training reasserted itself fully. He wasn't just Callum Burke, the grief-stricken drifter, anymore. He was Deputy Sheriff Burke, sworn to protect the innocent and bring criminals to justice. Molly Rowe was depending on him, just as his brother Sean had depended on him 2 years ago. This time he wouldn't fail. Thunder crashed overhead as he kicked open the barn's back door and slipped into the storm. Rain immediately soaked through his clothes, and wind whipped at him with surprising force. But the weather provided perfect cover for what he had to do. Moving with the stealth of a hunter, he circled wide around the farm buildings, using the storm's noise to mask his approach to the house. His plan was simple but dangerous. Get to Ada, secure the key to Molly's prison, and free the girl before Clayton and Jeremiah could stop him. Lightning illuminated the yard in stark black and white, revealing Clayton and Jeremiah taking shelter under the barn's overhang, while keeping watch for any sign of movement. They were positioned perfectly to defend the main approaches, but hadn't considered the possibility of a flanking maneuver through the storm. Callum reached the back of the farmhouse without being detected, and slipped through the kitchen door that Ada had left unlocked. The interior was dimly lit by oil lamps, and he could hear Ada moving around upstairs, probably packing belongings in preparation for whatever outcome this confrontation might bring. "Mrs. Rowe," he called softly as he climbed the narrow staircase. "It's Callum Burke. I need your help." Ada appeared at the top of the stairs, her face streaked with tears, but her expression resolute. "I heard the shooting. Are you hurt?" "Not yet. But I need that key to Molly's prison, and I need it now." Without hesitation, Ada led him to her bedroom and opened a wooden sewing box on the dresser. From beneath skeins of yarn and packets of needles, she produced a brass key that matched the heavy padlock securing the outhouse. "Here," she said, pressing it into his hand. "Save my daughter. I should have done this months ago." "Why didn't you?" "Because I was a coward. Clayton said if anyone found out about Tommy Walsh, we'd both hang as accomplices. He convinced me that keeping Molly alive, even in that terrible place, was better than letting her die on a gallows." Fresh tears streamed down her face. "I was wrong. Death would have been kinder than what we've done to her. You're helping now. That's what matters." A tremendous crash of thunder shook the house, followed immediately by the sound of splintering wood from downstairs. Clayton and Jeremiah had apparently decided to storm the building rather than wait for the weather to clear. "Burke." Clayton's voice boomed from the kitchen. "We know you're in here. Come out and face this like a man." "Go," Ada whispered urgently. "There's a back staircase that leads to the root cellar. You can get out through the cellar doors without them seeing you." Callum pressed her hand gratefully, then followed her directions to a narrow stairway that descended into the house's stone foundation. The cellar was dark and musty, filled with preserved foods and farming supplies, but it offered a way out that his pursuers hadn't considered. The cellar doors were heavy wooden panels set at an angle against the house's exterior wall. Callum pushed them open carefully and peered out into the storm. Rain immediately lashed his face, and lightning revealed the chained outhouse standing about 50 yards away across the muddy yard. Taking a deep breath, he plunged into the tempest. The storm had reached its full fury, turning the simple act of movement into a battle against wind and water. Callum's boots sank ankle-deep into the mud with each step, and he had to lean forward at a sharp angle to make progress against the gale. But the weather also provided perfect concealment. Visibility was so poor that he could barely see the buildings around him, which meant Clayton and Jeremiah would have similar difficulties. He reached the outhouse without being detected and immediately began working at the padlock with numb, rain-slicked fingers. The key turned easily despite the weather, and the heavy chains fell away with a metallic clatter that was lost in the storm's roar. "Molly," he called as he yanked the door open. "It's Callum. We're getting out of here." What emerged from that hellish prison was barely recognizable as the young woman he'd been secretly feeding. Molly Rowe had been beautiful once, but 6 months of confinement had reduced her to a skeletal wraith. Her blonde hair hung in filthy tangles, her dress was little more than rags, and her skin was pale as parchment from lack of sunlight. But her eyes still burned with an inner fire that spoke of an unbroken spirit. "I knew you'd come," she whispered as she stumbled into his arms. "I prayed every night that you wouldn't abandon me. I'm here now. Can you walk?" "I think so." But when she tried to take a step, her legs buckled from months of cramped confinement and malnutrition. Callum caught her before she could fall, lifting her easily despite his own exhaustion. "Hold on tight," he told her. "We're going to get through this storm and find help." But as he turned away from the outhouse, a muzzle flash split the darkness. The rifle shot went wide, but it announced that their escape had been discovered. "Back there," Jeremiah's voice cut through the wind. By the outhouse, more shots followed bullets whining past them in the darkness. Callum ran toward the barn, carrying Molly, and praying that the storm would continue to spoil his enemy's aim. But running through ankle-deep mud while carrying another person was exhausting work, and he could feel his strength ebbing with each step. They made it to the barn, just as another lightning flash revealed Clayton splashing across the yard toward them, his face twisted with murderous rage. The farmer was shouting something, but his words were lost in the thunder. Inside the barn, Callum set Molly down carefully behind a pile of hay bales. "Stay here and keep your head down. No matter what happens, don't come out until someone you trust calls for you." "Where are you going?" "To end this." He picked up the Henry rifle he'd loaded earlier and checked the action. 16 rounds in the magazine plus 1 in the chamber. It would have to be enough. The barn doors burst open as Clayton and Jeremiah entered together, their weapons ready. But they had made the mistake of silhouetting themselves against the lightning-illuminated sky, while Callum remained hidden in the darker interior. "Give it up, Burke," Clayton shouted. "Return my daughter, and we'll let you ride out of here, so you can kill her later." Callum called back from concealment. "I don't think so. She's my child. I have the right to decide what happens to her." "You lost that right when you chained her above a corpse." Jeremiah was moving carefully along the barn's left wall, trying to flank Callum's position. But years of hunting experience had taught the former deputy to track movement in low-light conditions. When the rustler stepped into a patch of moonlight, filtering through gaps in the wall, Callum's rifle spoke once. Jeremiah dropped his weapon and fell backward with a cry of pain, clutching his shoulder where the bullet had struck. He wasn't dead, but he was out of the fight. Jeremiah. Clayton spun toward his partner, momentarily exposing himself. Callum worked the rifle's lever and fired again. This shot caught Clayton in the leg, spinning him around and sending him crashing into a pile of farming equipment. His shotgun went flying, landing in the mud outside the barn doors. "It's over, Clayton," Callum called out as he emerged from cover with the rifle trained on the wounded farmer. "Tommy Walsh is going to get the justice he deserves, and your daughter is going to be free." But Clayton Rowe had one more surprise. As he struggled to stand despite his wounded leg, he pulled a small derringer from his boot, a hideout gun that Callum hadn't anticipated. "Nobody takes my family from me," he snarled, raising the little pistol toward where Molly was hidden. The Henry rifle cracked one final time. Clayton Rowe pitched forward into the mud and lay still, the derringer unfired in his hand. In the sudden silence that followed, broken only by the sound of rain on the barn roof, Callum heard someone crying. But it wasn't Molly. It was Ada who had appeared in the doorway and was staring at her husband's body. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though it wasn't clear whether she was apologizing to Clayton, to Molly, or to the world in general for the horrors that had been committed in this place. "Mrs. Rowe," Callum said gently, "we need to get your daughter to a doctor, and we need to contact Marshal Crawford." Ada nodded, wiping her eyes. Yes, of course. It's time for the truth to come out." As the storm began to subside, Callum helped Molly from her hiding place and supported her as they walked toward the house. Behind them, Jeremiah groaned and tried to stop the bleeding from his shoulder wound, but he was no longer a threat. "Is it really over?" Molly asked weakly. "It's over," Callum confirmed. "You're free now." The ride to Cedar Falls took 3 hours through mud-slicked roads, with Molly wrapped in blankets and cradled in the back of the wagon, while Ada drove and Callum kept watch for any sign that Jeremiah might have escaped. But the wounded rustler had been in no condition to cause further trouble, and they reached town without incident. Marshal Crawford was waiting at his office, having been summoned by a message Ada had sent with a neighbor boy. The lawman's expression was grim, but unsurprised as he listened to their account of the night's events. "I had a feeling something was wrong at that farm," he admitted. Clayton always seemed too prosperous for the size of his operation, and there were too many rumors about strange sounds and missing people. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Clayton and Jeremiah's crimes. Tommy Walsh's body was indeed buried beneath the outhouse floor, exactly where Molly had said it would be. The victim still wore his distinctive silver belt buckle, which several townspeople remembered providing irrefutable identification. But that wasn't the only body they found. A second grave behind the barn contained the remains of another drifter who had apparently stumbled onto the cattle rustling operation 6 months before Tommy. This man had no identification, but his presence confirmed that Clayton and Jeremiah had been killing to protect their secret for at least a year. The evidence of cattle theft was equally damning. Hidden in the barn were running irons used to alter brands, along with a ledger detailing stolen animals and their eventual sales. The operation had been sophisticated and profitable, involving the systematic theft of livestock from a dozen different ranches across 3 counties. Jeremiah, facing charges of murder, rustling, and conspiracy, attempted to claim that Clayton had forced him to participate through threats and coercion. But the ledger was written in his handwriting, and several witnesses identified him as the man who had negotiated sales of stolen cattle in distant towns. His defense crumbled under the weight of evidence, and he was sentenced to hang alongside his dead partner in absentia. Ada Rowe faced potential charges as an accessory, but public sentiment heavily favored leniency. The community recognized her as another victim of Clayton's reign of terror, and her cooperation with authorities was complete and voluntary. The district attorney ultimately decided not to prosecute her, accepting her plea that she had acted out of fear for her own life and her daughter's survival. "I should have been braver," She told Callum during one of his visits to the boarding house, where she and Molly were staying while the farm was settled. "I should have found a way to save my daughter sooner." "You saved her in the end," Callum replied. "That's what matters. Molly's alive because you found the courage to act when it counted most." Molly's recovery was a remarkable testament to the resilience of youth and the power of hope. Within 2 weeks of her rescue, she was walking around town accepting the kindness and support of neighbors who were determined to atone for their previous indifference to the rumors from the Rowe farm. The local Dr. Samuel Morrison was amazed by her physical and mental recovery. "I've seen strong men broken by far less trauma," he confided to Callum. "That young woman has a spirit that nothing could crush." But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Molly was her lack of bitterness. Despite everything she had endured, she spoke of forgiveness and moving forward rather than dwelling on vengeance. "Hatred would poison me just as much as it poisoned my father," she told Callum during one of their conversations. "I won't let his evil infect my future." Her strength and wisdom humbled the former deputy and helped heal wounds in his own soul that he had carried since Sean's death. The town of Cedar Falls, shamed by their collective failure to investigate the rumors from the Rowe farm, rallied around Molly with unprecedented generosity. The Henderson family offered to take her in as their ward, providing her with love security and educational opportunities she had never known. A subscription was raised to pay for her care and schooling with donations coming from as far away as the state capitol when news of her story spread. But Molly's greatest gift came from an unexpected source. Marshal Crawford, impressed by Callum's handling of the crisis and aware of his law enforcement background, offered him a permanent position as deputy sheriff. "This county needs men who aren't afraid to stand up against evil," Crawford said. "You've proven yourself beyond any doubt, and frankly, we could use someone with your experience and moral courage." Callum had been drifting for 2 years, avoiding permanent connections and meaningful responsibility because of his guilt over Sean's death. But his experience at the Rowe farm had changed something fundamental inside him. He had faced his worst fear, being too late to save someone who needed him, and this time he had succeeded. "I'll take the job," he told Crawford. "This seems like a good place to put down roots." The appointment was popular with the townspeople who had witnessed his courage and integrity firsthand. On the day he was sworn in, many of the same citizens who had ignored rumors about the Rowe farm came forward to thank him personally for his bravery. "You did what we should have done," one farmer told him. "We won't forget that lesson." 3 weeks after her rescue, Molly Rowe stood in the Cedar Falls Cemetery, placing wildflowers on the grave of Tommy Walsh. The young ranch hand had been given a proper burial with a headstone bearing his name, and the simple inscription, "He died defending what was right." Callum accompanied her along with Ada and several townspeople who wanted to pay their respects to a man they had never known, but whose murder had shocked them into a new awareness of their communal responsibilities. "He was just trying to do the right thing," Molly said quietly, staring at the fresh headstone. "He didn't deserve to die for it." "No, he didn't. But his death wasn't meaningless. It led to justice eventually, and it taught all of us important lessons about the cost of looking the other way when evil flourishes." "Do you think he would forgive us?" "All of us, I mean, for taking so long to find the truth." Callum considered the question carefully. "I think he would understand that sometimes justice takes time, but it comes eventually to those who refuse to give up fighting for it." As they walked back toward town, Molly surprised him with a question that showed how much she had grown during her ordeal. "Deputy Burke, what will you do if something like this happens again? If someone else needs help and the community wants to look the other way?" "I'll do my job," he replied simply. "I'll stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves, no matter what anyone else thinks about it." "Good," she said with a smile that transformed her thin face. "That's what heroes do." 6 months later, Deputy Sheriff Callum Burke stood on the main street of Cedar Falls, watching the daily bustle of a community that had learned important lessons about civic responsibility and moral courage. The Rowe farm had been sold to a young family from back east who were turning it into a successful grain operation. The old outhouse had been torn down and burned the ground beneath it, blessed by the traveling preacher who visited monthly. Molly Rowe was thriving in her new life, with the Henderson family attending school regularly and helping with their youngest children. She had grown stronger and more confident with each passing month, though she still carried scars that would never fully heal. But she also carried something else, a determination to ensure that no one else would suffer as she had suffered, and a commitment to speaking out against injustice wherever she encountered it. Ada had found peace working as a seamstress in town, using her skills to support herself, while slowly rebuilding relationships with neighbors who had initially been suspicious of her role in the tragedy. Her complete honesty about past events and her obvious remorse had gradually won acceptance, and she was now considered a valued member of the community. As for Callum himself, he had finally found what he had been searching for, without knowing it, a sense of purpose that went beyond personal grief and self-recrimination. His brother Sean would never return, and the guilt of that loss would always be part of him. But he had learned that the best way to honor Sean's memory was to ensure that others didn't die because help came too late. The badge on his vest caught the afternoon sunlight as he walked his daily patrol, and citizens nodded respectfully as he passed. He had become exactly what Marshall Crawford had hoped for, a lawman who understood that true justice required not just enforcing the law, but having the courage to act when others preferred to remain silent. In the distance, church bells were ringing, calling the faithful to evening service. As Callum walked toward the sound, he reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. He had come to the Rowe farm as a broken man seeking only temporary work. He was leaving it as someone who had rediscovered his calling and found redemption in service to others. The prairie wind still blew across the endless grassland, carrying with it the scents and sounds of a vast, untamed landscape. But now it whispered different stories, not tales of hidden crimes and unanswered screams, but songs of justice served and communities strengthened by shared moral purpose. Some battles Callum had learned were worth fighting regardless of the personal cost. Some people were worth saving even when the effort seemed hopeless. And sometimes the most important thing a person could do was simply refuse to walk away when someone needed help. That knowledge had cost him blood and pain and sleepless nights. But it had also given him something invaluable: the understanding that individual courage, however small or seemingly insignificant, could make the difference between justice and injustice, between salvation and damnation, between hope and despair. As the sun set over the prairie and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Deputy Sheriff Callum Burke walked toward home with the satisfaction of a man who had found his place in the world and intended to defend it against all threats, foreign and domestic, obvious and hidden, present and future. Behind him, the lights of Cedar Falls twinkled like earthbound stars, each one representing a family, a life, a story that mattered. And somewhere among those lights, a young woman who had survived the unthinkable was planning her future, with the confidence of someone who knew that good people would stand up for her if evil ever threatened again. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything that mattered in a world where the difference between civilization and savagery often came down to whether ordinary people had the courage to do extraordinary things when the moment demanded it. The wind carried no more screams across the prairie, only whispers of hope and the promise that justice, however long delayed, would always find its way home.